Well, welcome to a very special edition of Coffee and Contemporary Art, a Tuesday edition. Today we have two incredible speakers. We have Dr. Sara Woodbury and Dr. Lida Zeitlin-Wu here to speak to us a bit about Barbie's very special Pantone color pink. Barbie has become very synonymous with the color pink, but what we may learn from the exhibition downstairs, as well as this conversation, is that this color being associated with Barbie is not something that has always lasted through the time of Barbie. It really seems to have come about in the 80s or so. So we're gonna learn a bit about this color, maybe what it means for the branding and marketing of Barbie, and just a bit more about the research and expertise of these two incredible scholars. So can we get a round of applause for our two doctors here? Can I give you this mic?
Oh, would you like to All right, can you all hear me? Great. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming out on this Tuesday. We're going to keep this talk really informal. It's just going to be a conversation about color, Pantone, and we'll just see where it goes from there. And we'll open up to Q&As at the very end. So does that all sound good?
Yes.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Lida, for speaking with us today about Pantone and Barbie. But let's get a sense of who you are first. So I know that you're a media studies scholar and you focus specifically on color. How did you get interested in that? And what has been one of the most surprising things you've learned about color?
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I know some of you, but for those of you who don't know me, I am a professor in the Department of Communication and Theater Arts and also the Institute for the Humanities here at ODU. My training is my PhD is in film and media studies, but I consider myself a very interdisciplinary scholar. Back in undergrad, I actually studied Russian literature. And so my interest in color started really early on. I was always interested in this kind of paradoxical aspect of color, right? On the one hand, it seems super subjective. How do I know that the color I'm seeing is the same one you're seeing? Of course, people have different levels of color acuity, different associations, emotional associations with color. At the same time, as evidenced by companies like Pantone, over the course of the 20th century into our current digital moment, color becomes this increasingly regulated, standardized, privatized thing, right? For those of you maybe who work in media, right, you'll think about the different kinds of color notations like in Photoshop. So there's this kind of these two parallel tendencies with color. On the one hand, this kind of very objective, rationalized aspect. On the other hand, this kind of very subjective aspect. So that was kind of what always interested me in color. I've written about a lot of aspects of color, from the way that certain writers use color in the context of literature to more recent topics like colorization and AI, or color and Instagram filters. And so right now I'm writing a book called How Color Became a Technology, The Making of Chromatic Capitalism. And so basically when I say technology, I just mean a tool or technique that can be wielded as a means to an end, or a tool that governs our everyday experience. So spoiler alert, this means to an end is almost always to make a profit. So the book really is about color as a driving force of capitalism, but also the way that color is essentially used to sell ourselves to ourselves. So think about the way that something like Pantone will market certain emotional qualities as associated with color. So I guess that has been the kind of same reason I've been interested in color, is also the thing that's been surprising about it, which is that color seems to thrive on contradiction. It's both difficult to regulate, but also seems to operate very well on regulation and control. And I'm interested in the ways in which, on the one hand, color is associated with these kinds of very ephemeral things like personality or wellness, or even just something like vibes, right? We could think of examples like that. But at the same time, the way that companies like Pantone sell color to us as a kind of conveyor of sort of, like for example, the most recent Pantone color of the year, Mocha Mousse, was all about coziness, right? And selling a particular version of coziness. At the same time, that kind of marketing is only possible through this highly regulated use of color. And I'll also say, maybe it's a bit beyond the scope of our conversation today, but one thing that has also come about through this research on color is the kind of entrenched relationship between color and race in the US. This very complicated and sometimes troubling relationship, and the way that these kinds of standardized color systems are enmeshed within the existing structures of white supremacy. So that was kind of a lot.
Oh, but much appreciated. It's always great to have context and to see how rich and how much depth your research goes into. So my next question concerns Pantone itself, because I know for me, when I think of Pantone, I think of these fabulous little color booklets that we actually have that we'll pass around. But as you mentioned to me in one of our recent conversations, the history of Pantone actually goes back much further than that and takes on different types of materials. So do you mind telling us a little bit about the history of Pantone itself, how it got started, where it began, what it sold initially, and how did it get involved so strongly in color?
So maybe before I answer that, if I could just get a quick show of hands, how many people before coming to this event had heard of Pantone? Okay, some yes, some no. So for those of you who don't know, and maybe for those of you who do know, Pantone is a US-based color forecasting corporation. It brands itself as a global corporation because it does now have physical headquarters in a few different countries, Hong Kong, I believe Germany, but it is very much based in the US still. They offer color consulting services, which is to say that they employ people who can help, individual designers or brands kind of navigate their color palettes, what colors to choose, and so on. They also manufacture software and design tools based on their patented color matching system. So for example, they have something called the Pantone Color Capture, which basically you scan an everyday object and it supposedly will then tell you, oh, this is this particular Pantone color. I have used this before and I found it to be not always super accurate, but the point is that they've expanded to a lot of different ways of selling color in this kind of commercial or design sphere. However, at the kind of very start of the company, they were very humble. Pantone actually began as a small print shop in Carlstadt, New Jersey in the 50s, and their main headquarters, their main factory is still in New Jersey, which actually a lot of the world's factories are in New Jersey. And so even though it just started as this kind of mom and pop print shop, since then its commercial success and geographical scope have really increased exponentially to the point that for a lot of people, even people who aren't designers, know Pantone, right? So they kind of use this terminology. They describe themselves as the gold standard of color consistency, and having successfully captured the rainbow, though we should definitely take this kind of rhetoric with a grain of salt. What does that even mean to capture the rainbow? And although they are a privately owned company rather than, say, a government one, the Pantone matching system is used for everything from national flags to universities. So ODU's colors, official colors, actually correspond to specific Pantone numbers. And then of course you have characters in franchises like Barbie where the role of trademark comes into play, right? Like you can't use this particular color unless you pay us and go through us. But I think that the question of sort of, has Pantone always focused on color? It's a little bit tricky because I think here we need to distinguish also between color and material. So Pantone started as a printing shop, right? So they're selling inks. They're not necessarily selling color as such. Of course, color and pigment are related. But it began as this printing division of a small company specializing in cosmetics matching cards. It was called M&J Levine Advertising. And then in 1962, Lawrence Herbert, who was working at this division, purchased M&J Advertising and then renamed it Pantone. And then under his direction, the company developed what we now know as the Pantone matching system. So a very, very simplified version of the Fandex you're seeing. The first iteration only had 10 colors. They were all meant for print. And then over the span of 6 decades, this has ballooned to over 5,000. And then on top of that, they're not just geared towards print, but also towards digital technologies. So as to sort of how color plays a role, you have on the one hand these kind of inks and print-based technologies, on the other hand colors that are designed for electronic screens. And then you have kind of the concept of color itself that they're selling in this kind of color of the year, which I haven't really explained that, we can talk about it more. But I would say we could make the argument that Pantone maybe started at first focusing mostly on materials and printing technologies, but now the role that color plays in their company is kind of more nebulous. Like, what are they selling? Are they selling the color itself? Are they selling the system that categorizes it? Are they selling the technologies that reproduce it? Or are they selling a particular vision of what color can mean for the consumer?
Wow, that is certainly more involved than you would ever guess looking at a Fandex like that. But you bring up some great points, particularly when it comes to the legal dimensions of colors. I thought perhaps we could get into that a little bit, because I know that certainly was a contributing factor to the curation of our Barbie exhibition. What does it mean when a company owns, if not the color itself, the right to use it, and how does that affect design?
Totally, and I think after this, I would love to hear about the kind of maybe unexpected legal obstacles that you faced in curating the show, which I know you and I have talked about a bit. This is very thorny, and I should say I am by no means a legal expert, right, or a lawyer, and I actually have talked to some professors of law about this specifically to try to get a sense of what does it mean to own a color, right? So my understanding is that there are a few different ways in which Pantone is able to kind of attach their name and their brand to specific colors. The first is kind of more straightforward. It's patenting the reproductive technology itself. So like we saw with the kind of proprietary inks that they have. The Pantone color system for print has thousands of proprietary inks that are mixed from these base colors that are based on a secret formula. So that's a kind of very old school understanding. It's like we have the secret formula and you can't have it, right? And then there are also the kind of digital equivalents, so the capture scanning technology I mentioned. They also market several lighting booths for color calibration. So that's kind of straightforward, right? It's like we have a patent on that technology. Then there's also putting up a paywall. So I don't know if anybody here is a Photoshop user, but back in 2022, there were Pantone colors you could use in Photoshop, and they decided to put up a paywall so that suddenly, unless you start paying I think it was $15 a month subscription, all colors that were Pantone colors, even in pre-existing files, would fade to gray overnight, which is really kind of interesting to think about in terms of, you know, why try so hard to control use of these colors, right? So the paywall essentially shows maybe that the company is having a hard time preventing copying through IP law, and at least there's an attempt to kind of slow that copying down. More relevant for our discussion of Barbie, though, would be trademarking. So trademarking can be used to protect a color that has come to be a market identifier for a certain entity's goods and services. So this would mean that in this case, that you would have to make the case, if you're going to try to trademark a color, that this color has come to have what's known as secondary meaning, which is to say some kind of meaning that identifies the brand that goes beyond the simple color itself. So we could think about with Barbie, what is that secondary meaning? But we could also think of something like Tiffany blue or Coca-Cola red, right? Those are trademarked colors that also have Pantone numbers, that those have secondary meaning. At the same time, there is a difference between trademark and copyright, in that trademark is really about brand identifiers and logos, and copywriting, I think, is a lot more complex here because it's about protecting creative works like books and films. Like Pantone does not own the Barbie movie, but they might own the Barbie color. And so as for the ramifications of this, I saw some people making faces with the Photoshop example. Like very clearly, right, this is an access issue. Who gets to say that these corporations get to control our usage of color, the capacity for artists and creators to express themselves in certain ways. So suddenly, self-expression and creativity aren't rights, they're something behind a paywall. And so there is one artist, if you're interested in this, his name is Stuart Semple. He's English, And a lot of his work is a kind of playful or satirical takedown of what he calls big color. So like big data, basically, right? So in 2022, when the Adobe paywall went up, he created a free Adobe plugin called Freetone, which was accessible to everyone except for those who work for or are affiliated with Pantone. And then he actually, after the Barbie Pink movie came out, he released something called the Barbiest Pink, which I believe was actually a pigment. But I mean, the whole thing, it's sort of a joke, right? But it's accessible to anyone who doesn't work for or represent Mattel. And he said that this was, a protest against what he called Mattel's color hoarding. So there are definitely artists who are really calling this out and sort of demanding that color be something that is free for all. So yeah, Sarah, maybe you could talk a little bit about, like, now that we've sort of connected that to color in the context of Barbie specifically and the curatorial experience and how that played a role.
Oh, absolutely. Just a quick remark from me. The comment about having to pay this subscription fee to use the Adobe colors. I mean, that's just life in general now, isn't it? I'm thinking like subscription services. Hey, you already paid for this service, but if you don't want to see that Liberty Mutual ad for the 50th time, pay another fee on top of it. Or new cars. Well, the feature is built into the car, but if you want those heated seats, you have to pay a subscription fee. So this idea of just adding additional fees to reap out more money, I mean, I don't know which stage of late capitalism we're in, but apparently we're in that stage.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I'm happy to speak to the curation of the show. Before I dive into it, let me tell you a little bit about myself and the museum for those of you who may not know me. So, hi everyone, I'm Sara Woodbury and I'm the curator of art here at the Barrie Art Museum. I come from an art history background. That's what my bachelor's and my master's are in, and then my PhD is in American Studies. So I went a little rogue for the last degree, but still very much involved in the arts. Now, the Barrie Art Museum, as you know, is a relatively new institution. It opened in 2018. It was founded by Richard and Carolyn Barrie. And as far as the collection goes, I like to think of it as his, hers, and theirs, because they had separate collecting interests and shared ones. Together, the Barries are really interested in modern and contemporary American painting and studio glass. And then Richard's personal passion is for maritime painting, so lots of ship's portraits, that sort of thing. And then Carolyn's personal passion is for dolls. So that is why we have a Barbie exhibition up at the moment. And that is why when you go into Gallery 4, you will find all kinds of dolls, including our other #1 Barbie. The prize we award for that is the self-satisfaction of knowing that you found it. So, the Barbie exhibition. This show was a long time coming. We started discussing it several years ago. And we've done several different doll shows in that time, from 19th century bébés to contemporary indigenous sculpture to Madame Alexander, Martha Chase. But Barbie presented a unique challenge because of Mattel. Mattel is very protective of the Barbie brand. And additionally, there is already a licensed exhibition that Mattel put together that's been traveling around the country. It's up at the Museum of Art and Design in New York right now, if you want to check it out. So when we set about doing this show, the biggest challenge for us and opportunity was we needed to set our show apart from their exhibition. When visitors would walk into the show, there needed to be no confusion. Nobody would think that this is the licensed show going through our museum. So we differentiated it in a couple of different ways, in both its content and its appearance. Content-wise, how we set it apart was we contextualized Barbie within the longer history of fashion dolls, because Barbie did not materialize out of nothing. People have been using fashion dolls as reference points for centuries, and we have a large fashion doll collection within our holdings. So putting Barbie in conversation with these fashion dolls from the 18th and 19th centuries was the easiest way to distinguish our show from Mattel's. We have Barbie and many, many friends, as opposed to just Barbie and her immediate circle. But content alone wasn't the only way that we needed to distinguish the show. We also needed to make sure that it looked different, that nobody, again, would get it confused with the show. And that is where color plays in, as well as font. Barbie has, along with a Pantone and official font, it's called Barbie Medium, and we did not use it for the show. But we also made a point of avoiding her Pantone color. So what I did was, it was a couple of different steps. The first thing I had to do was to make sure that I knew which color to not use. So I looked it up in the Pantone, I found, okay, Pantone 219C. Definitely will not be using that. I then went through our paint books, because we tend to order our paints from Benjamin Moore, and I found the closest to that Pantone shade, because it wasn't an exact, but it was close. I'm like, all right, you are not using that one. So now we know which colors we're not using for the show. Now let's figure out what colors we are going to use. And this was the fun part, because I got to pull on some of my art history a little bit. One day, I couldn't focus at my desk, so I ended up heading over to the Chrysler Museum, because knowing that we were going to have older fashion dolls going into the same show as Barbie, I needed to make sure that we picked colors that would harmonize well with both. Because our older fashion dolls, the bébés, the poupées, they're lovely ladies, but they're older ladies. They're of a delicate constitution, and bright pink might not necessarily set them off as well as, say, Barbie, who is a newer, more vibrant doll in some ways. So I wanted to find a color combination that would work well for both. And so what I ended up doing was I walked over to the 19th century galleries, contemporaries of our fashion dolls, and I just started taking photographs of every pink and purple combination that I could find in the paintings. Still life scenes, Degas ballet dancers, genre scenes. There was a meat market scene that I liked the colors in. There was a beach scene, pointillism, impressionism, expressionism, anything from the last quarter of the 19th century I photographed, and then I looked at those respective palettes. I took the photos and I set them aside the Benjamin Moore books and said, all right, what color families do these hues tend to lean in? Is it more of a bluish purple? Is it more of a reddish one? Is it more on the brown end of the spectrum? Is it a really light pink, more of a pastel? Is it more saturated? And once I did that and started seeing some combinations that complemented each other well in both the Benjamin Moore book and in the paintings, that's when I narrowed it down to the colors that we had in the show. So the pink that you have here, not Barbie Pantone, is actually called Spring Azalea, and I don't remember the number, but it is several shades lighter than the Pantone. So in addition to avoiding that exact hue, I made a point of going several shades lighter so that there would be no confusion. And then its counterpart is in the same value chromatically, but it's a different hue, so it's more of a grayish purple. And I thought that, again, would complement some of our older fashion dolls, but also distinguish the two parts from one another, because we did want to instill that sense of drama from the Barbie movie and from Barbie's brand more generally. So we early on talked about having basically this Wizard of Oz moment in the show, where you start out with these fashion dolls on one side of the exhibit looking at these bébés and poupées or whatnot, and then you walk through into Barbie land and everything gets keyed up, because you can't go halfway with Barbie. It is maximalist, it is bright, it is pastel, it is neon, it is all the above. So having those two colors too helped with that visual presentation. And once we had the dream house replica downstairs built as the gateway between the two, then that became the passageway. You start out with the fashion dolls, you see what came before, and then you walk through into Barbie's world, and you just happen to be living in it.
That is so fascinating, and I'm also just struck to hear you mention Benjamin Moore, which, Benjamin Moore, Sherwin-Williams, these are kind of paint companies, right? If you're picking out colors for your wall, but they are kind of rival companies that emerged around the same time that Pantone did in the 1950s, where there was this kind of post-war economic boom and desire for picking different colors for your home and things like that. However, those two companies have not at all had the same kind of cultural reach as Pantone, therefore they don't have the same kinds of legal issues. And I guess I'm also thinking, one thing I forgot to mention is that Pantone/Mattel trademarking Barbie pink, this didn't actually happen until the early 2000s. So I don't remember the exact year, but I want to say it was 2007 or something like that. So Sarah, if you had been curating this show in the 90s, you could have used whatever pinks you wanted, right? I even read, I'm seeing the Life in Plastic, It's Fantastic reference, that you know, if Aqua were releasing Barbie Girl now, she wouldn't be able to have, you know, the color on her album unless she had you know, paid Mattel or whatever. But I guess I would love to hear your thoughts, because even just looking around all the different hues of pink, right, and that pretty recent Barbie Dreamhouse we're looking at with all of these different hues of pink, why like, this particular pink being Barbie pink, this kind of hot pink, but also Barbie wasn't always so connected to this particular shade of pink, or even pink at all, right? So that kind of timeline part of the show downstairs, and even that 60s dream house there, you see that there wasn't always this entrenched relationship between Barbie and pink. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about the historical evolution of Barbie's association with pink. If anything, did the 2023 film solidify this? And also, like, how does gender come into play here? Because that's sort of, I think, been the elephant in the room. We haven't really discussed it, right? Pink and femininity.
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I love these programs, because I'll say from my experience as a curator, 90% of the research you do on a show does not go in it. Because if you did, people would be trapped for days reading about it, and nobody needs to be subjected to that. So instead, you get to listen to me talk about the stuff that didn't go in the show. And absolutely, happy to speak about Barbie and her relationship with pink. So you're right. Pink was certainly in her early wardrobes from the beginning, but it wasn't exclusively associated with her. If you go downstairs into the show, if you haven't seen it already, and you cross into Barbie Land, you'll see one of our #1 Barbies on view with a lot of her accessories. Take a look at the other dresses in there and you won't see pink in them. There's, my favorite is this apple sheath dress, so it's like this navy blue that has red and green apple print on it, and it's lovely, and it's not pink. And so it wasn't inevitable that she would become exclusively associated with pink. And in fact, I would say for the first couple of decades of her existence, her wardrobe, if anything, is paralleling broader tastes in society as to what color is. So if you look at her first dream house, for example, over there, that is very much channeling the trend of both mid-century modernism in California and Scandinavian modernism, which favored a lot of natural woods and kind of these natural earth tones paired with these bright pinks, but also blues and oranges and whatnot. So it was the contrast between the two, the natural and the bright, the vibrant and the earth tone, balancing each other out. That whole house is very 1961, 1962 in its architecture, its decor, its colors. Whether or not to your taste is another thing, but it's of its time in a fascinating way. And you see that continue through the 70s as well. Downstairs in the exhibit, our dream house is modeled off of the 1979 dream house, and we actually do have the 79 dream house up in this top quadrant of the piece. And that too is very 70s, not only in its architecture, but its palette. It's based off of the A-frame, which was an architectural form that took inspiration from alpine ski lodges and was very popular in the 1970s. I remember as a kid in Prescott Valley, Arizona, seeing so many A-frame houses because that's when the town was really built, was in the 60s and 70s. Did it make sense for middle central Arizona? Absolutely not, but it did make sense in terms of the architectural tastes of the time. And the same with the color palette. If you look at the dream house in detail, it's got harvest gold and avocado green and all of those colors that we consider quintessentially 70s. Very earth tone, golden browns, very leaning toward the warm end of the spectrum. We start to see pink become a bit more dominant in the 1980s. And there's this fascinating book, I can't remember the author's name because I'm terrible with names, but it's called Forever Barbie. It's a few decades old, but it's a classic. And it makes this argument that you start seeing pink become more popular as Barbie is taking on more executive roles in her professions. So Barbie from the get-go has always held a variety of jobs, and her jobs reflect changing tastes of the time. So in the 60s, you know, she's a graphic designer, but she's also a stewardess, she's a secretary. She's doing the types of work that would have been acceptable to white middle-class women in the mid-20th century. But as the 70s and women's lib and women's rights are ramping up, her career options expand accordingly. And by the 1980s, you're seeing Barbie dolls like Day to Night Barbie, where she's an executive of the day and a party girl at night. She works hard and she plays hard. And she's also wearing an exclusively pink wardrobe, both with her suit and her party dress. The suit is actually not that far off from the spring azalea along the wall, whereas her night dress is more akin to the Pantone color that we associate with it. And a lot of people have speculated that the reason why we see pink coming up more often is that it's a way of counterbalancing her perceived threat as a woman of power. Because in a patriarchal society, women in power are scary because that is not the norm. Women are supposed to be subjected, not in power. And one way to maintain that power without threatening the patriarchy is to amplify your feminine qualities. Oh, I'm strong, but I'm soft. You know, I'm still feminine, I'm still a woman, I'm still involved with the care and nurturing of children. I still have those feminine qualities. And what better way to do that than by wearing what we consider the most feminine tone of all, pink. Now I say we because color has long and complicated histories, and the association of femininity with pink is a relatively recent thing. If you go back to the 18th or the 17th centuries, pink is a masculine color. So, this is one of the reasons why, I'm just gonna go on another tangent for a second. This is one of the reasons why I hate the term timeless. Nothing is timeless. Nothing is inevitable. There is a history behind it, and that is how we end up what we do, is when we think it's inevitable, but it actually isn't. And that's what, the same goes with Barbie. Did she necessarily have to end up with this shade of pink, or pink at all as her exclusive color? Absolutely not. But Barbie, what makes her so enduring as a brand, for better or worse, is that she speaks to the times in a way that few other dolls have over the past several decades. A great example is, I took my parents here a couple weeks ago to see the show, and my mother brought up a doll that she had as a kid with one of our graduate assistants named Tressie, who was a rival of Barbie, whose hair could grow. Like either you pressed a button or you wound up a crank or something and her hair grew out and it could retract. And nobody had any idea what she was talking about, but Barbie was of that same time period and is still around. We still connect with it. Barbie as a brand has been able to, for the past 6 decades, speak to our society and what its concerns are, what its anxieties, as well as its aspirations are. And I think that's why the pink question is so fascinating, because it is speaking to social anxieties about women in power and how you counterbalance that. And the more ambitious Barbie's career has become, the bigger her dream houses get, the pinker they also grow at the same time.
Yeah, I buy that argument a lot about the increasing pinkness to counterbalance kind of Barbie's increasing power. And it does feel like we keep returning to this moment in a US context at that kind of post-World War II moment. That is also the moment Sarah's referring to where now it's become a cliche, right? Pink is for girls, blue is for boys. That's how a lot of baby clothes are marketed. But that was fairly recent. I mean, because it's not that recent, but recent-ish, like 1945 to 1960. So I think that really is fitting with the way that you've curated the show. You kind of mentioned that Wizard of Oz moment where with those poupées and bébés or whatever they're called, there's a lot of, a lot less of that color. And some of that has to do with the emergence of new materials like plastic, right? Life in plastic, where you could have these very lurid hues. And I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, but just thinking about sort of why this particular pink, I think also not all pinks necessarily have the same associations, and so I don't know if people remember millennial pink back in, 2016, and you had, it was kind of the color of the moment, which Pantone then kind of capitalized on to release 2 colors of the year that year. It was Rose Quartz and Serenity, and they were both pastels. One had a kind of pinkish hue, and the other was more bluish. This was the same year, or around the same time that Drake released Hotline Bling, Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel came out, and sometimes this color was also called Tumbler Pink. And Pantone in their press releases, and I'm always kind of very critical of that they always use this very generic, that kind of rhetoric you were just saying you hate, right? It's timeless. But then at the same time, they're also saying it reflects a cultural moment. So they said that this blending of these two colors reflected a, quote, global gender blur in design. So it's like they were kind of promoting this very progressive narrative, like gender doesn't matter. Clearly it does, but it's been interesting to see, like, is the pinkness of the 2023 Barbie movie different from that? You said the book is from the 90s. And so I think there's been a lot of mixed reception to the Barbie movie, right? Where it's like, is it this post-feminist movie that's using the pink ironically, or is it actually just kind of re-cementing that association between pink and gender and so on? So it's super interesting, and I totally agree that this is the importance of thinking historically, and colors never just mean one thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another dimension I would throw into it too with the Barbie movie that we've also been seeing at play with a lot of our visitors to the Barbie exhibition is there's also the nostalgia factor. And the idea of, especially with that movie and thinking about the different hues of pinks, because I'm looking over at the 2023 Dream House over here, and I'm seeing, you know, the lurid, vibrant tones of pink in the slide and whatnot, but I'm also seeing softer, more pastel pinks. And that's making me think of some of the dream houses from the 90s, which were basically the McMansions of their time, where they had this pseudo-Victorian aesthetic and whatnot, and everything was pastel. I don't know if any of you remember the movie Addams Family Values, but I just always think of Morticia when she goes, I respect, you know, your willingness to take over Uncle Fester and whatnot, but pastels? You know, and how these different associations come up with different pinks in terms of, well, you think of light pink and you think of your grandmother's furniture, and that can't be Barbie. We need something hip and vibrant and alive and modern, and I think that's one of the reasons why her Pantone is such a vibrant hue, and it's so alive that our screen couldn't even handle it. But yeah, this idea of pink being a feminine color, but not necessarily an exclusively soft one either. It can be bold, it can be neon, it can be powerful, and can hold the room and overpower it even. So I think that's one of the reasons why Barbie's pinks especially can be so vibrant, is this idea again that yes, she's feminine, but she's still powerful.
How much time do we, I want to make sure, when is a good time to, I mean, I could talk about this forever, but I just want to.
Looks like we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'd say whenever you want to open up questions, if anyone has one, or.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kind of keep it open if anybody has a question that occurred. Ezra, yes.
Just to drill in a little more on the history and known timeline of pink and gender in America, where do you see Barbie really playing a role in cementing that? Was it firmly established already, girls in pink, boys in blue, before pink became so associated with Barbie? Yeah, maybe just to
Yeah,
a
sure.
little more about that. And then a second follow-up for either of you. This is very American-based company, American-based culture and society. While they've made their little efforts to have more, international dolls as well, I'm curious if there is an example from another country, another culture that comes to mind that has some parallels to this, but is still different from it.
Both great questions, and for the sake of the recording, I'll repeat them here on the microphone. So the first question is, did Barbie's alignment with pink coincide with the gender associations of pink in mid-20th century America? And the second question is that, actually, could you repeat it again? Because it was such a great question, I want to make sure I repeat it properly.
Can you think of a parallel to could be dolls or could be another toy in another country that is so firmly associated with color, the way Barbie is with pink, but is not American, is reflecting another culture's perspective and values at a time?
Great. And the second question was, is there another example that's not American of a toy that's strongly associated with a particular color, and what are the values associated with that, if you can think of an example? So while I'm thinking of an example, let me rewind to the first question. So as Lida pointed out, the association between pink and blue and girls and boys and whatnot, that is a post-World War II association, at least in American society. This is coinciding with, again, the end of World War II and ongoing efforts to address the fact that women were in the workforce during the war and were able to do the job just as well, but now we need to get them back in a domestic environment. So there's this doubling down on binary gender roles in the post-war era, and it plays through in color, it also plays through in fashion. The example that I'm thinking of is Christian Dior and the New Look. The New Look was looking backwards, actually, at fashions from the turn of the century. So in the 30s and 40s, you see, particularly in the 40s, women's fashion takes on somewhat more masculine qualities, a lot of shoulder pads. It's very practical, again, working in factories and whatnot, a lot of jumpsuits, that sort of thing. But in the late 40s and 50s, you start seeing the return of hourglass figures, wasp waist, for example, lace, crinoline skirts. You know, the full skirts are coming back into fashion, playing back to these conventional ideas of, again, gender binaries. So that was already in play to an extent when Barbie debuts. And when she appears, again, pink is part of her wardrobe, but it's not exclusively it's not her exclusive trademark at this point. I would say what's really she's primarily about at this time is being modern. She is a modern American teenager. She debuts as a model in 1959 and takes on other careers after that. But the main thing is that her wardrobe is up to date with the times more generally. So it tends to include the types of colors that are popular in general. I would say the really strong associations with pink start in the 1980s and especially into the 1990s. So I mentioned Day to Night Barbie downstairs, but I'm thinking especially of her dreamhouses. That's where you really start seeing pink become so predominant in her wardrobe. And also, yes, as Susie pointed out, you know, if you look at these carrying boxes up here, around the time you get to the 80s and 90s, you start seeing a lot of pink stuff. Whereas if we look at the examples from the 60s and 70s, you have orange, you've got green, you have other hues. So it's really more of a late 20th century phenomenon that we see. And I think it's doing two things. On the one hand, yes, it's playing to, again, downplaying the threat of the modern woman in these executive roles, but I think it's also a way of solidifying the brand's recognition in terms of, you know, you see pink, you think Barbie. So it's a marketing strategy as much as it is a social concern. And then I've been going on for a minute, so let me hand over to you.
Sure, so in terms of the second question about the kind of cultural specificity, non-US context, I think there is a really, I mean, connected specifically to this conversation around pink, there's a really fascinating book by an anthropologist named Christine Yano, Y-A-N-O, called Pink Globalization, Hello Kitty's Trek Across the Pacific. It's really interesting because it's about how, you know, Hello Kitty is produced by Sanrio, so it is a Japanese brand. However, the author basically argues that Hello Kitty, especially at the beginning, was marketed deliberately so that its cultural origin, or her cultural origin, was ambiguous. And so she uses a Japanese word that means, I think it means something like without culture, but what her argument is that this so-called without culture is already very imbued with certain Euro-American norms. And so this idea of pinkness was already probably, you know, connected to these same kind of US narratives of pinkness. And that was in part how Hello Kitty became so commercially successful beyond Japan. So that's not so much, you know, an example of there may well be other examples where it's like, this is a Japanese franchise that is not trying to globalize in the same way. But I think this idea of sort of color as going across these global borders, it would be kind of reductive to say, okay, well, it's just, you know, globalization as Americanization. At the same time, there is this kind of legacy of US dominance, and, you know, you could even say that here color is maybe a form of kind of soft power where US norms become regimented elsewhere. There is a South Korean photographer named Jung-mi Yoon who has this project called the Pink and Blue Project, where she basically photographs little kids, I think primarily in South Korea, just surrounded by their toys and their dolls. And I mean, this is probably from at least 10 years ago, but it's very striking. It's like the little girls are just like, it's sort of hard to do justice just descriptively, but it's like this tiny toddler or baby just like surrounded by a sea of pink stuff or a sea of blue stuff, and it's all these like cheap, mass-produced, plastics, and as a way of kind of showing this kind of global spread or dominance of these U.S. or Western-focused colors, to the point that more localized color traditions actually start to kind of become erased.
And oh yes, I saw your question. I was just going to say quickly, and that brings up a great point too, in terms of why is Barbie so influential? It's the mass production. I mean, the dolls that we have downstairs, they're wonderful, but they were really catered to the affluent classes. They were rich people's objects, so there just weren't as many produced because they were considered high-end. Barbie, at the very least, when she debuts, is catering to the middle class. And with plastic and whatnot, she's just become ubiquitous in a way that other dolls haven't, because she can be produced at such a large scale. So I saw you had your hand up, and then you had your hand up.
My question was more about like using color in like Barbie to go with morality. Because an animated movie I remember, like in Barbie animated movie, is Barbie in a Christmas Carol. And during that movie, she really wears pink. Like, because she's the villain in that story. Barbie is the villain in that story, and she really wears pink. And the first place you start seeing pink is when she starts redeeming herself. And like her room is like completely pink. But that's only when she starts redeeming herself. And her best friend in the story, who's a good character, wears pink all through. So like, but Barbie doesn't wear pink in that movie, which is one of the first animated movies that doesn't wear pink. So I was wondering if they probably do things like that to make sure that like Barbie's pink is not associated with like bad behavior and things like that.
That is an excellent observation, and thank you so much for sharing it. I'm now going to have to check out this movie. So the comment was, in the Barbie Christmas Carol, Barbie is actually the villain of the piece, which I find hard to believe, but I guess she's the Ebenezer Scrooge character who has to go on the redemption arc. And to demarcate her status as a villain, she doesn't wear pink. And it's only when she undergoes the reformation of traveling with the ghosts of the three spirits and whatnot, and learning the true meaning of Christmas and all that, that she becomes herself again and embraces pink. And the question was, does Mattel do that intentionally to ensure that her color is associated with positive qualities? And I would say absolutely. I think it's all part of the branding.
Yeah, I have not seen the Barbie Christmas Carol. That's fascinating. I think probably because precisely there is a tendency, and of course it's gendered, but for pink to be associated with kind of superficiality and vapidness. So what I immediately thought of is Legally Blonde, where she shows up to Harvard campus and she's wearing, all like very much the kinds of pinks we're seeing here, and some Harvard law students are like, hey, check out Malibu Barbie. And so that's the stereotype, which is then kind of upended because she's actually super smart and has a lot of depth. But it would make sense to me if Mattel was actively working to kind of counteract that, which is again why you can't say, this color always means this, because this would be a case of a company very intentionally trying to attach certain meanings to colors. Yes?
To play off of the Legally Blonde information that you just shared, I was putting that together in my head as the talk went on, and I understand that the use of pink is very intentional, and why, to make us look less colorful, and go ahead, do patriarchy. But, I'm looking at the kinds of pink through the ages that have been on here. And they're not all the vibrant pink that we associate with her now. And the ones that look like they're from the 2000s are reflective of what you see her wearing in Legally Blonde. She's not a pastel person. And so she's saturated in that pink. And then as we get to like the 2000s, her Barbie pink is really intense. And her case looks like a briefcase. So I'm wondering if there's an intentionality behind the deepening and intensity of the pink to represent women moving forward and getting noticed in society and exerting their power. And so that pink that you're wearing is a more powerful pink. It gets noticed, people pay attention to it, and it's not automatically written off anymore. So I'm just wondering if there is some sort of timeline or if that's intentional on Mattel's part.
Okay, great. So the question was basically, is there a way to ascribe intentionality to Mattel in terms of this kind of move towards a more kind of fuchsia hot pink over time, maybe in the 2000s? And it's a great question. I feel like, and I'm sure Sarah has more to say on this front, but I think, it's always hard to prescribe intentionality, and I think also, with a company like Mattel, of course they want to make it seem like they coined all of these things, but you made a great point, right? Could it be that cultural touchstones like Legally Blonde actually maybe had an influence on the way Barbie was marketed? It doesn't have to be just top-down Mattel, right? There are all of these ways in which Barbie has entered the zeitgeist and might be shaping conversations. I think it's also maybe important to situate, which Sarah already did, right, with the dreamhouses, these different historical moments for Barbie. The color palettes also echo the color palettes of the period. So if you think about, and also the way that these palettes are recycled over time, like and it's a bit of a generalization, but it's like every 30 years, whatever was popular comes back, right? So the 80s being very vibrant, the 90s being a little lighter, then we recently had a return to the 80s, and now the 90s and early aughts are back. So I think that's part of it. But I do think there maybe is something about the boldness of the pink. I'm also thinking like Samantha Jones from Sex and the City, and this kind of like, I'm a corporate woman wearing a double-breasted blazer, but it's pink. But yeah, I don't know, Sarah, if you...
I would say it's all the above. I think there's definitely intentionality going on with it, because if I've learned anything from working on this Barbie show, it's that Mattel takes design very seriously. So I think absolutely there is research going on into this. But it's also, as a brand that is so part of the culture at large, I think it's also reflecting other influences from films, TV shows, and whatnot. Barbie has always been a multi-way dialogue between Barbie herself and the world she's engaging. So I think it's a combination of intentionality and indirect influences, and some we're aware of, others we aren't, and that's what keeps it interesting. But that's a great observation, and I'm so glad you made it.
Most colors, when they're really popular, after the popularity wanes, we don't see it reflected in marketing anymore. So, we don't see avocado green anymore, right? It's just everybody uses shag marketing and bad appliances. And, right? And so the Barbie pink that we have today was huge in the 80s, neon and really, really saturated, really rich pinks. And then, like you said, the culture went a little more soft for the next couple of decades, but this stayed and just got more intense. So I just wondered about that too, because most trends, obviously fade, they do come back 30 years later, but this one has maintained throughout that 30-year period.
Just to quickly answer, so the point being that there are hues like avocado green, which seem to date themselves really fast. What is it about this particular association with pink that has endured? I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about trademarking and secondary meaning. Avocado green isn't attached to an enduring cultural figure like Barbie, so I think that's part of it. And I know, Hagari, you had a question, but just as a kind of counterpoint, I was thinking about how, and this makes me feel super old, that American Girl recently released their latest historical dolls who are from the 90s. And they're twins, which I'm guessing is like an Olsen twin reference. But the pinks that they are wearing are very much more like that, what was it called? The orchid something?
Oh, yes.
Spring Azalea. Which is very similar to the 1990s Barbies we saw in the show. But American Girl, just to contrast with Barbie, doesn't have one color connected to it the way that Barbie seems to have developed for reasons you sort of touched on.
Yeah, so kind of going on about the marketing of color and how it might change with trends attribute a specific color to a brand, how to change along with it. How do you feel that the Barbie movie coming out in 2023 and purposefully addressing the patriarchy within that movie and the role of Barbie, kind of making fun of Mattel as being this male-only company that's trying to understand women? How do you think or feel that color or Mattel has been able to market themselves and change with the social trends that have continued and made Barbie pink no longer be considered overly feminine or overly like soft in the way that it used to?
Yeah, so essentially how has Mattel managed to stay current and to not face criticism for maybe promoting kind of retrograde idea? I mean, I feel like with the Barbie movie, I mean, it's in some ways it's sort of an impossible situation because on the one hand, Greta Gerwig trying to critique aspects of Mattel, but it's also an official Mattel movie, right? So it's like there's only so much you can do there, and I think that was the source of a lot of critique of the film, as it was like maybe trying to have its cake and eat it too on that front. I mean, this is a very cynical take, but I feel like we live in a time where anything that was once considered sort of avant-garde or progressive can then just be kind of sucked back into the corporate lingo, right? So is there, and Kate, I see Kate that we've been talking about this, like is resistance even a thing that is meaningful anymore when a company like Mattel can say, like, I see your critique of the patriarchy, we're gonna just absorb it back into our brand. That is maybe a more cynical take. I don't know, Sarah, you have thoughts on that?
No, I think that certainly is one reading of it that's accurate in terms of, well, you know, we can take any idea and market it back to you. In terms of how Mattel continues to stay relevant with the changing times, I would say it's less about their actual use of color and more in their emphasis on diversity in their doll representation. So yes, pink is absolutely, it's part of the brand recognition. You know, you see the pink and you're like, ah, Barbie. But if you look at the actual Barbies out today, like the Barbie Extra series, the Fashionistas, I think they've leaned really hard into a variety of representation. And you see that particularly in the 2020s panel, where we've got a fashionista with vitiligo or prosthetic leg or whatnot. And again, that could be critiqued as, oh, you're just, you know, what better way to reach your entire audience than to get every member within that audience? But at the same time, being able to see yourself in Barbie can be very empowering. So I think it can be read in a multitude of ways. All right, so I think we're at just about time, so we'll wrap it up here. But thank you again, everybody, for coming out. And thanks again to Lida Zeitlin-Wu for coming out and speaking with us today.